Welcome to Fort Worth 148's podcast, where we meet to discuss Masonic topics and strive to build value in the Brotherhood. The opinions and statements of the participants do not represent any positions or stance of any Grand Lodge or Lodge and are solely the viewpoints of the participants. Welcome back to the podcast, brothers. This is Rhit Moore, past master of Fort Worth 148.
This is Billy Hamilton, current senior warden for Fort Worth 148.
This is Gabriel Jagush, Fort Worth 148's junior warden, and we have a special guest tonight.
This is David Hill, worshipful master of Parsons Lodge, number 222 in Austin, Texas.
It's good to have you, Brother Dave.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. And from what I understand, Evie's stuck in traffic and will sneak on later. So we'll see if he speaks up or not. This is final episode, brothers. This is it.
For the year.
Of the year.
Yeah. Let's be clear.
We are not getting canceled.
Yes. What a good run this year was. And that was what I kind of had for our discussion question. If it is, what was y'all's favorite episode of the year? And Dave, that includes you as well, if you wanted to pipe in.
I guess with the silence, I'll jump in there.
There you go.
You know, I think my favorite one was the live episode, the 3-hour tour with Ricky and DP and all them. That was that was long, but I loved every minute of it. Either that or maybe the Suits and Skulls, because as hilariously, interestingly divisive as that topic can be, y'all handled that really well.
Yeah, that was a hot potato.
So for me, hands down, I think my favorite episode was the live episode with Ricky Cox and Don Paul Payton. And on that, I think it was just a vibe of being there and just having like an informal chat that went on for 3.5 hours, because of course we didn't record everything, but
yeah,
there was some stuff that, we didn't, we of course talked before we even started hitting the record button, but It was just so natural. Right. And it was so, personal. It was a great feeling. Other than that, there's been a lot of great episodes this year. Going back through it, I think it was great. Right Worshipful Paul Underwood, that was a good episode. Learning about his background. Michael Paul's always fantastic to talk to. There's just been a lot of good conversations I feel we've had this year.
Yeah, there was. I looking back at it, I was like, man, we did do some pretty interesting interviews.
Yep. Gabe,
you got a...
So I think it's unfair. It's an unfair question because the live episode was so good and so different. The York Right Power Hour, as I like to call it, that was very fantastic. So I'm going to pick my second favorite episode from the season, which was our interview with Brother Paul Rana. Because that's when we started getting into like the weird deep end of esotericism, and it's like, what does this look like when we start? What does really different forms of Masonry look like? And Paul was able to start answering, well, if you want to talk about strange French occultic Masonry, this is what it looks like,
Yeah.
And I live for the weird. So that was, Paul's doing his job keeping Austin weird. So.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome stuff.
Yep.
No, that was an interesting episode. And of course, the live episode for me was, it was something different. So it's certainly a highlight to this year, and something that we need to figure out how to do more of next year. But my favorite was the Paul Underwood, because it was like a really walk through the halls of that home and school. And that was, such a major accomplishment for our fraternity that's just kind of glossed over now that it's been closed. But the amount of people that affected and changed their lives, it's incalculable. It just bleeds through so many different ways, from teachers to volunteers to the, of course, the actual students. But it was just such a game changer. And that's something definitely I would like to dig into more, have some more former home and school students, give us the rundown of what it was like. It was good stuff. All right. Well, I think we got that covered. Before we get started, the last NPR moment of the year, I know a lot of you guys are thinking about going and leaving feedback and rating us on your podcast app, but go ahead and do it. You've got 2.5 months before we come back on, so we should be flooded with them by then.
Yes, we're abandoning y'all for the winter season.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm correct on my scheduling, this episode should come out at around Thanksgiving time. If not Thanksgiving Day, I'm not sure. I'd have to check my schedule to see when I have each episode lined up for release. But yeah, so happy Thanksgiving in advance.
Yes, yeah. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas,
Merry Christmas,
Hanukkah, whatever you celebrate.
And Happy New Year, because the next time we'll see a lot of you guys is in person at the Grand Lodge Communication
in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be fun.
2020.
So that's our NPR moment. Thanks for all your support so far, listeners. We appreciate your support and feedback a lot. It's especially meaningful to get to talk with our friends and stuff and have them reach out to us about, hey, I really like this episode, or, even when I got 2 phone calls about one episode, and neither of them were stellar reviews, right? And I won't say what episode or who called or whatever, but they were about the same episode, and so it's okay. I had fun fielding those phone calls.
That's the nature of the beast, man. We cover a lot of topics, but that's what we want. We want people to be passionate about it. Change my mind, man.
Our fraternal spotlight tonight is with Brother David Hill. Tell us about yourself outside of the Masonic lens.
Sure. So professionally, I'm a psychologist. So I have a doctorate of psychology. It's a PsyD rather than a PhD. It means I've just done a little more on the clinical side of training than the research side of training. I guess early on as a young man, I read the Rosicrucian manifestos from the 1600s and was pretty inspired by those. And those kind of set me on a path of service early, which is great. I tend to be pretty politically active for mental health concerns. I'm up at the state capitol quite a lot talking to legislators and staffers. I'm active with Texas Psychological Association. I'm on their political action committee board. So we raise a lot of money for legislative issues and awareness for mental health for Texans. And I'm also president-elect of my local area society, the Capital Area Psychological Association. So I'll basically be in there next year, running that small organization. So professionally, I'm pretty engaged. Masonically, I tend to be pretty engaged. And all that tends to keep me from running streets too much.
Nice. So when did you join and how old were you?
I joined Masonry in 2012. I think I was maybe 37 back then. I'm 45 now. But I had just finished up grad school. I went out of state for my doctoral program and made it back to hopped back to San Antonio at the state hospital there for a year for a pre-doc internship. Then did my postdoc at juvenile probation here in Austin. And when I got settled back in Austin, the plan was always to kind of come back to Texas and return to Austin. And when I got back here, getting started in Masonry was one of the first things I did because I wanted to surround myself with good men and, try and have an impact on the community. And, always had a very favorable view of the institution. And it definitely did me right.
Nice. So, I mean, what inspired you to join? Was it Grandpa?
No, actually, I'm the first Mason in my family. I guess I have a cousin by marriage who was a Mason a few years before me in a different state. But for me, when I was a young man coming up, I was reading about the founding fathers of the U.S. and of our great state of Texas. I noticed that a bunch of them were Masons, and I think in my history book, maybe they even had that photo of George Washington in his apron. Reading about the anti-Masonic party and government and wondering what the heck was this Morgan affair thing. It was always kind of on my radar. Also, when I guess my late teens, I got started reading, various Victorian and Edwardian esoteric authors. So I'm a big fan of the deep esoteric stuff, the consciousness and spiritual elevation that we can put ourselves through. And most of those authors back in the days, they were all Masons too. So I figured there's got to be something there. So yeah, I had it. I was looking into Masonry for 15 years before I joined.
Just like everywhere you research kind of led you back to that, this guy's a Mason too kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed very familiar because all these guys that I was interested in were all doing the same thing. So I knew at some point in my life it was something I wanted to get active in, and I'm really glad I did.
Yeah. So, which lodge did you join and why?
I joined Hill City Lodge number 456 here in Austin. I had two friends who were members there, and they got me coming out. I guess one of them is no longer active as a Mason, and the other was Brandon Jenkins, who was one of my top line signers. Y'all probably, most of the listeners know him from the Grand Lodge concerts that Waco 92 would put on. He would sing out there, but he died from a congenital heart issue and didn't come out of surgery, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But he was a big influence on me coming in. Actually, still he's a big influence on me. That guy, his heart was massive, and he taught me a lot about how to be a better man. But anyway, I went into Hill City 456, and later on I moved my membership over to Parsons Lodge. It was just, as far as the lodge goes, it was a bit of a better match for me. Hill City's more of a boots and jeans lodge, and I'm more of a formal kind of guy. I'm also a member at Robert Burns, which is a tuxedo lodge. So on the skulls and suits episode, I'd definitely be in the suits corner.
Yeah.
But yeah, I love a bunch of the guys at 456. We get along really well, but definitely found my home at Parsons.
No, and I think that's a great point to kind of highlight that, nowadays it's hard, when you're joining, you usually just join that first lodge you go to. Mm-hmm. And that's fine. If you have the wherewithal and the know that each lodge has its own personalities to go visit, that's great, but that's typically not the case. But you can still shop around once you're raised, and find that place you're going to get the most out for your Masonic journey.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to take the reins in your Masonic journey. And if you're not visiting, by God, go visit. One of the first things I did when I took the East was the East was kind of shifting up my meeting. And one of the things that I added to the meetings was a traveler's report. So if anyone's traveled to any other lodge or jurisdiction, let us know about it. Maybe you'll encourage some of the brothers who haven't done a lot of traveling to start doing some. It definitely widens your perspective of Masonry.
That's an interesting thing. Yeah, that would be cool. I know Jeff Bennett just started a Facebook group, the Masonic Road Trip. Where we share those. Yeah, that's a good idea, because anything to encourage guys to visit is a good thing.
Yeah, a couple of things I snagged from other lodges around the area that I started adding to my meetings were readings from A Great Light. So we started off reading from the Holy Bible, of course, and then we're kind of doing a tour of interesting quotes from different holy books throughout the year, and also reading from the Grand Master's decisions, because I know you guys talk about that occasionally on this podcast, but a lot of guys aren't even aware of what they are, or that if approved, that they're as binding as anything in that law book.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Those are kind of a secret part of the law, and they're just as binding.
Oh yeah, and it's always fantastic to go through and those Grandmaster's decisions. Sometimes you can kind of see the reasoning behind why we have some of the laws we do.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. You scratch your head and wonder, like, who did what that decision came out that year.
Oh yeah, some of the questions asked are just like, oh my goodness, that needed to be clarified. Interesting.
Right.
So, it's fun. Even the ones that, don't get approved, or, the answer's no or whatever, it doesn't change anything. They're still interesting to read, where they're coming with their interpretation.
I never thought I'd be a big enough Masonic nerd to get really into the things about the law and Grandmaster's decisions, but it's interesting coming from that perspective. Why was this laid down this way, and what occurred that they had to have a Grandmaster's decision, and it gives you a lot to really think about.
Yeah, there's no doubt. It gives you a different perspective on that law.
Yeah, I've discovered that I'm pretty passionate about jurisprudence, and I realized that 15-year-old me would be absolutely horrified.
Oh, yeah, I'm with you. What have you done with yourself?
Yeah. Who are you? I don't even know you, man.
Oh, what a difference a year or two makes, right, Gabriel?
Yeah.
Hey, I'm
calling my mom. You're bullying me.
I got to say, I'm 45. One of the things I love about Masonry is whenever I walk into a lodge, people say, "Hey, young man, how are you doing?"
Yeah, that's the truth.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, you said you're worshipful master at this point. What other offices have you held?
Well, let's see. I'm active in both the York Rite and the Scottish Rite. So right now, I'm Right Illustrious Deputy Master and Austin Council number 2. So I'll be going into the East there after I'm done the East of my Blue Lodge. And I'm scribe in Lone Star Chapter number 6. So then after I get done with council, I'll be in the Eastern Chapter. So I'm having a bit of a trifecta back-to-back there. I'm sword bearer in the Commandery, Colorado Commandery number 4, and I'm appointed office in 3 of the 4 Scottish Rite bodies here in Austin. So I'm doing some officer stuff and kind of going through the line. I'm also on the building board for the York Rite Temple in Austin, and part of what we're doing is looking into possibly getting that redeveloped. So it's been a whole massive thing that's been undergoing. So it's been an interesting journey, and something I have very little experience with, but I'm learning an awful lot really fast. I'm also on the Scottish Rite Dyslexia Foundation board here in Austin, so raising money to train dyslexia teachers and making community connections to make that possible.
Interesting. So what was your progression like up to worshipful master? Was it all the wardens, deacons kind of thing?
So I had started out at Hill City and then moved over to Parsons. And one of the things when I was moving over to Parsons, it's a smaller lodge. It definitely has problems filling out its line, so it needs help. So getting, it's Hill City is like an every single week lodge, very large lodge, very robust. And Parsons is just your more typical kind of smaller lodge, which I like that kind of intimate atmosphere. And it's kind of a once a month plus a work night lodge. So I went in as junior deacon. And then at the time, we had somebody who was going to hold over and senior deacon. He didn't want to move forward. So I hopped over senior deacon to junior warden, then senior warden, and now worshipful master. So I had a pretty fast track up through there. If it wasn't for that officer leadership training, my head would have been spinning. And luckily I had some really good mentoring as well. Kai Perry, Victor Armstrong, Mark Dermott, they were all instrumental in really working closely with me and helping me get ready for my year in the East.
Nice. Yeah, I mean that is a quick climb, I guess, but most guys are. It happens even a year or two quicker.
Yeah, doing the math, like I guess I'm still a really young Mason. I mean, I've been a member of the craft for a little over 7 years now, and that's about enough time to go through a line.
Yeah,
but I feel like I want to fill in at sometimes some of these other positions because, I feel like I've missed a bit of the experience. But as master of a small lodge, I'm also serving as steward of my lodge this year. So I'm kind of doubling up.
Yeah. A way to humble yourself, but then cooking.
Yeah, well, I'm not particularly a great cook, but I can certainly hit Costco with the best of them.
There you go. So, what do you see as the biggest strengths and weaknesses of our fraternity?
I've been doing a fair amount of thought on this, and y'all talk about this from different perspectives on a number of your podcast episodes, which is really kind of interesting. I mean, and some of those discussions have gone in a lot of depth. But I think as far as strengths go, as counterintuitive as this may sound, it's the flexibility of the craft. So we talk a lot about how, like Rhit, I've heard you at Grand Lodge talking about the C word change. You don't say that whenever you're presenting a resolution, otherwise you'll get booed off.
Yeah.
Change is something that the craft does tend to resist. I mean, it's kind of like turning a cruise ship. You got to take a slow arc, right? But if you look at it, it really responds to the needs of every generation. So like the World War II guys wanted a more social experience, and that really happened. These days, things are kind of shifting back towards education and esoterics. That accommodates the needs of the guys who are currently coming into the craft and coming up. Young men always want some education, how to be a better man. And I think the Masonic deep education and esoterics are the way that the current generation is kind of looking towards it. And you get the mentoring in there as well, of course. But if you look back to some of the articles from the 1920s, they were deeply esoteric. So you can kind of see that focus of Masonry shifting over time if you kind of walk back in time. So I think that's a real strength.
No, I think that's a good way to describe that, because it does feel that it does have the flexibility to fill that void for each generation.
Yeah, and I think that's a real part of the beauty of the craft. As members of a new generation take up leadership positions, they influence the direction of the craft, and that becomes an honest expression of the needs of that particular generation. And as far as weaknesses go, I think really when officers don't avail themselves of all the opportunities to learn leadership skills. So what can sometimes happen is somebody will fill a seat for a year and the lodge will basically coast, or sometimes will start to nosedive depending on the person in the seat. And that can cause a real problem locally. So this is, I have a real high education focus as far as my Masonic experience and what I enjoy. So like the Grand Lodge of Texas has the officer leadership program. Used to be called the Warden's Retreats. Fantastic program. I mean, if you don't have a thorough background in leadership, that'll help you understand the challenges of leadership and what to expect in running a lodge. Yeah. I think all elected officers in Texas who haven't been through that program should do it. You might just be doing your lodge a disservice if you don't. And the Life program has some great information in there as well. But that officer leadership training is absolutely stellar, and I recommend it to everybody.
Yeah, there's a difference between the hands-on effect you get at the officer leadership training as opposed to the Life book, because you do get good information out of there, but it's just going through books, and it's not the same as sitting around a table of 6 or 7 other brothers from around the state, hearing their problems, hearing their solutions, and vice versa. There's a real magic to that.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And I think, there's no reason to be finding yourself in the East just sort of hoping to make it up out of thin air. There are some fantastic resources already in place to fix that problem.
Yeah, and I also understand if it's one of those things you just can't make to, either because of time or finances or whatever it may be, there are other avenues, because you mentioned having good mentors as well. You can reach out to these education committee officers, and I'm sure they'll give you some of the resources you get there to help you with your year.
Oh yeah, those guys are really responsive. I mean, shoot, I have them on Facebook. I don't recommend Facebook for official, communication, but it sure is easy to get into hold of people with it. And, those guys write me back right away.
Yeah, because you've got guys, you got an issue comes up that you're not for sure about. There's a whole bunch of people out there that you can contact to help you through those situations. So, can you give us an example of how you feel the fraternity's made you a better man?
Sure. Yeah. For me, it was something I really didn't expect out of the fraternity. I went in kind of expecting some Masonic education, whatever that might be. I didn't really know. I was really interested in the esoteric side of things, so really wanting to look into that, kind of get deep into ritual and symbolism and all that good crunchy stuff. But what I found, one of the things that I love the most about the craft is the intergenerational friendships I've developed. So, I'm friends with guys from their early 20s all the way through their mid 90s, and that's amazing. So, my wife actually talks with some envy about how I've got all these mentors that I've developed through Masonry, and they're guys who've, they look at me and I'm half their age. And so I'm definitely a young man when I walk through that door. And that's really wonderful because I can benefit from their experience, and they can benefit from my perspective. I was over at a lodge meeting where that Archie Scott was at a few months ago, and he was talking about some of his old war experiences in World War II in Korea, being at the Battle of Chosun Pass, and that just blew my mind. I mean, that's notorious stuff, and he's an honest to God war hero. Shoot, the guy who taught me my work, Sam Henson, he was a tank commander in the Battle of the Bulge.
Wow.
Some of these guys are honest to God heroes, and we're rubbing elbows with them every single day.
Yeah.
It's amazing. And I feel like my family has really grown by being involved in Masonry. Yeah, there's a quote I actually ran across from Proverbs the other day. As iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens the countenance of his friend. That's Proverbs 27:17. I think that's really beautiful and kind of sums up that fraternal experience.
Yeah, there's something about being around guys like that have been through those experiences, war especially, that just makes you want to buck up and be a better dude. It's like, you feel like you owe them that at least.
Yeah, I mean, examine what your issues are and consider what they've been through and realize, man, your issues are actually definitely first world problems. They're things that, once you sort of reorient on them, they're actually not that big of a deal when you look at it.
Yeah. It reminds me, one night I went to a meeting at Crowley Lodge, just some random night. I don't remember what it's for. I know it's a stated meeting, but I don't know if it's official visit or what. But it was the anniversary, the 70th anniversary of D-Day. And we were sitting in lodge with a guy that stormed those beaches 70 years ago. And it was like, this is the greatest thing in the world. It's just a random chance that I happened to go. I had no idea it's going to be there, but it was just like, I'll never forget it.
Yeah, and these are the guys who you're just hanging out with in lodge all day. You never know what treasures your brothers are until you start getting to know them.
Yep. Interesting stuff. Well, Gabe and Billy, y'all got quiet. One of y'all want to take us into the main subject?
Sure. So, David, one of the things that you're kind of known for is traveling and giving presentations at different lodges. Can you give us kind of an example of the different subjects that you present on and maybe an overview of those subjects?
Sure. I'm still fairly new to doing Masonic lectures. I just started doing them I don't know, maybe a couple of years ago. John Tolbert down in San Marcos has an event he calls Bruno's Banquet. named after Giordano Bruno, where he has some esoteric speakers come out and speak on a topic over a lovely dinner, and it's hosted by the San Marcos Scottish Rite Club. And I'd been attending those for quite some time, and got to know John over a period of a number of years. I'm a plural member down there at San Marcos because I love what they're doing. And he invited me to speak there. So I did a talk on the psychology of initiation, and that one's been extremely favorably received. I've given that, I guess, up in the Metroplex, down San Antonio, throughout Austin, Central Texas, a number of places, and people have enjoyed that quite a bit. I'm not new to public speaking professionally. I've been doing this for years and years. I've spoken all over the U.S., multiple places in Europe, even down in Australia and New Zealand. So I've done a fair amount of public speaking. It's something I really enjoy. I actually, for part of my practice, I do a lot of psych assessment, which means I'm basically typing all day. So I used to write a lot academically and do sort of academic exploration of my fields of interest and publish those either privately or publicly. And but now generally the last thing I want to do when I get home is more typing. So, but I can throw together a talk, and I love talking to people. It's always interesting going both ways. I learn a lot, and I present material that I've been reading about to other folks and kind of looking into. But yeah, that as far as topics go, that psychology of initiation is the one that kind of got me started talking at different lodges and different groups. There's a kind of reduced aspect of that that I do for kind of small instated meeting programs, which is just focusing on the use of the senses in the degrees by the candidate. And it goes into depth into considering the different senses and how they impact the candidate. And it really is designed to have people consider the technology of initiation. So kind of what we're doing with initiation is we're putting someone into an altered state, an altered mental state through kind of holding stressful postures at the altar. Like, remember your fellow craft, how awkward that was. Mm-hmm. After a while you just start getting, you're zoning out when you're repeating lines back and forth, when you're doing your obligation. There's all sorts of things that are done to specifically shift the senses and shift the way that people are experiencing the world around them during initiation. And there have been various techniques to do that, for thousands of years. In the Mithraic mysteries, they would have you basically in isolation in a cave for a long time. Pythagoras in his school, he'd have people have like 3 to 5 years of silence before they could even start to talk when they're studying the mysteries. There's the rites of Eleusis. They had their kykeon, right, which is supposedly a psychoactive substance they give people. So they trip their way through their degrees. That there's all sorts of different things that people have done. I think Masonry has inherited a lot of those techniques, that technology for allowing these moral and symbolic lessons to become deeply implanted in the consciousness of the new initiate. So, I like getting into that stuff and kind of digging into that. And I go into that from different models in the psychology of initiation talk. And I'm kind of working on some new talks right now as well. But I recently was invited for kind of a one-off, which was interesting, down in San Antonio at their Scottish Rite. I was invited to do a talk on the esoteric bad boy, Aleister Crowley.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, right. So I didn't expect to be asked to do a talk on that particular topic by Masons, because usually he's, through kind of more edgy occult folks, he's sort of a darling of them. But within Masonry, rightly, he has a negative reputation. And so there's some things with his character and approach, and certainly the way that he embraced negative press that caused him to be viewed askance. But I actually kind of approached that from kind of looking at the wild claims and then going into his life as an actual human in history. And, talking about how he was a champion mountaineer. He was one of the first people to try and tackle K2. In fact, the people who eventually summited that mountain many years later took his initial route up the mountain. Champion chess player, amazing poet. So the guy was had a lot to offer. But yeah, and I focused that talk on kind of his path through Masonry, which was very interesting and irregular. He was raised in Mexico City, I believe, and coroneted a 33rd degree in what appears to be an irregular Scottish Rite jurisdiction at the time. But I think, I say irregular, so that's, I guess, just not recognized by the United Grand Lodge of England. So
Gotcha.
Technical, right? So I think it was more through the Grand Orient of France at the time. And he, tried to regularize himself a few times and eventually got fed up and got tired of the politics because he was never brought in a way to understand kind of how this whole recognition system works and why, and never really properly acculturated because he was kind of traveling through and they slapped all these degrees on him, said, have a nice life. And as he returned to Europe, he found himself having some problems navigating, unsurprisingly. So kind of got into depth with that and some of his schemes to take over the Masonic world up in Detroit. He spent some time up there, which was interesting, tried to take over the Scottish Rite and Masonry in Detroit. And unsurprisingly, they didn't take well to that. So that's kind of a wild ride through his Masonic life.
That'd be interesting. Yeah. That guy is usually scoffed off, and like you said, rightfully so. He's got a crazy reputation. But he's got some nuggets in there, some interesting stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And he was involved in a lot of really interesting, I guess today we'd call them French Masonic rites that were still active and either, more acceptable or less acceptable depending on the jurisdiction that he found himself in, like Memphis Mizraim. That's a fascinating one that I've looked into with some amount of depth over the years. I don't know if, Scottish Rite, we spend a lot of time trying to put on 32 degrees. Most valleys can't do that. So imagine trying to put on like 95, 97 degrees. That sounds ludicrous. But,
That's Illuminati stuff.
Well, even more so. The Memphis Mizraim, it sounds pretty fascinating to me, but it's not regular in most jurisdictions. Although a few years ago, I did visit a lodge out in Croatia, and they were excited because a bunch of them were working Memphis Mizraim, and it's totally regular there. So you never know. Recognition, right?
Yeah, interesting. I did want to touch on, because you mentioned the altered state of consciousness that we're trying to get our candidates in during initiation. And, that's one of those kind of trigger phrases to where people think you hear altered state of consciousness and you want to go towards something like drugs or some craziness like that. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But if you really drill down on that, your normal state of consciousness is like cruise control in life. You see things and you're smelling things, but, it's not like you're in a heightened state of sensory. And that's what we're looking to bring these guys to. It's not something like we're going to, create some trippy situation for them, but you're going to bring them to a heightened sense of awareness, which is an altered state of consciousness from what we're normally in,
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's not that we're getting into, and I don't want to say woo woo, but that's the best way I can describe it.
Yeah, it's woo woo.
Yeah,
although there's not woo woo is not always a bad thing. You just have to know that you're in woo woo territory.
Yeah,
well, and it's kind of lightly there, really, because if you're looking at it like if you take away someone's sight temporarily, well, then they're going to be focused a lot on their feet and their sense of balance so that they don't fall over. And that's going to change. Their hearing might be sharpened. So if you're saying something, they may be really focused on what you're saying while also trying not to stub their toe. And that's really concrete, very kind of practical ways to shift consciousness. So shifting consciousness isn't like shooting your psyche out of a cannon or anything. These are just really subtle physical shifts, actually. Being placed in an uncomfortable posture. So if you look at yoga, asana is basically posture. And in that training, you hold a particular posture for a long time. And what happens when you do that is you start getting supremely uncomfortable. But then there comes a time where that discomfort, you pass through it and you transcend that discomfort, and it shifts your consciousness. You're experiencing the world around you from a different perspective. And that's just from sitting in the same position for a long time. I mean, if you're normally sitting in your chair, you're moving around a fair amount. I mean, you don't sit still too long. Otherwise, your butt starts to fall asleep or whatever. Also in yoga, pranayama, it's different ways to breathe. So you can breathe in through the nose, hold it, breathe out through the mouth, hold it. In psychology, we teach people how to control their breath to interrupt panic attacks. So it can that can either increase or decrease nervous system arousal. So you're basically working with these different arousal states in the body, and just using the way your body operates to make a shift in that, so that you accentuate your experience as you're going through those degrees.
Yeah.
So, I don't know how woo it is, but for me, it just seems fairly concrete.
Yeah, and that's
you cited some very concrete examples. I was thinking like altered consciousness, I was thinking of far more in the woo spectrum. That all of what you cited is like, oh yeah, like that is like biologically that makes sense, So I was thinking a little bit further off in the outfield.
And I think what we're talking about too is not altered consciousness as having illusions or anything like that, but more of having a heightened sense of presence.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, that's it. Because that's an altered state of consciousness. We don't go around in that heightened sense of consciousness all day. Mm-hmm. There's times where you're driving down the road and you're like, how did I get here again?
Yeah, that's interesting. And a lot of this is dealing with the way the brain's wired. So part of my background includes some training in neuropsychology and biological psych. So functional neuroanatomy to me is kind of fascinating. So, say you're driving, right? And you're having a conversation with somebody and you're getting there just fine. And then you realize, man, how did I get here? I don't even remember turning in. I was focused on that conversation. But there's a whole different region of your brain that's responsible for those motor reflexes and those decision trees that allow you to successfully navigate traffic. So you don't have to be 100% present. I mean, you're still doing it. And if something occurs that's outside of the norm, your consciousness is going to be alerted and you're going to focus on that car that's doing something stupid ahead of you. But other than that, a lot of that stuff is sort of a little bit on cruise control. And that's just the way we're designed. Yeah. So taking people out of that cruise control, like you were talking about, is important to allow some of these moral lessons that we're teaching to, take hold deeply.
Yeah, and as silly as it may seem sometimes that you got guys correcting you, it's like, no, his foot needs to be here or you need to be placed there. That may seem silly, but there's a point to it all, and it's important. So, no, I wanted to touch on that. Oh, another thing I wanted to bring up. Have you ever read Cliff Porter's book? It's called The Secret Psychology of Freemasonry.
I have not read it. I've had probably 4 or 5 people, bring that book up to me, but I haven't read it yet.
Yeah, it's an interesting read. Of course, he's a law enforcement, a detective. I think he's sheriff now, but he does a really interesting job of breaking it down. It's a great book. Would definitely pick it up at some point.
Excellent. I'll have to do that. I do a fair amount of work in forensics, so that would probably be of interest to me.
So, go ahead, Gabe.
Oh, yeah. I wanted to circle back around to the different presentations that you've given. Of the presentations that you've given at the different lodges, which one would you say that was your favorite to give, or that you personally got the most value out of?
Well, I really like the psychology of initiation lecture that I give. It gives people different ways to think about not only the candidate experience, but also your experience at different points of your Masonic career within the Blue Lodge. So one of the things I talk about is that every degree actually consists of 4 separate initiations. So there's the time that you go through it as a candidate. There's the first time you see it from the sidelines. There's the first time that you're in an officer position, a supporting officer position. And then there's the first time that you're conferring the degree. Each one of those are distinctly separate and gives you a very different perspective on that degree. So, also it talks that in that particular lecture, we go into different models of spiritual development. So part of my training in grad school was in transpersonal psychology, which is a branch of psychology that integrates the spiritual with the rest of the human experience. Because psychology could be defined as the study of the totality of human experience. Within that, the realm of the spirit or spiritual development has been woefully understudied. Psychology tends to approach things from a deficit model, right? You're depressed. Okay, so that's bad. So how do we make you not depressed? Or somebody's anxious. Okay, it's causing them problems at work, or they can't sit through a test at school. So how do we help them deal with that anxiety? But the spiritual development piece is actually taking it from a more positive perspective. How do we shift our consciousness in ways to become more self-actualized? So, in that talk, I present a few models for how to do that, both from kind of a Jungian perspective, because Jung is someone who a lot of people are familiar with, especially within kind of Masonic and esoteric groups, because Jung talked about alchemy and different legends and all this and different ways to consider psychology or psychological organization. So, I present some of his material and also go through some interesting material from Wilmshurst and some other authors that talk about the lodge as a model of the human psyche and kind of walking people through different ways of development through that. And if there's enough time, I kind of go into the tree of life and some Kabbalistic concepts, and basically just giving people some interesting working tools that they can kind of ponder when they're thinking about their own, psychospiritual development, especially in conjunction with Masonry.
Interesting.
What would you say the biggest facet of that psychology of initiation, what would you say the biggest facet of it that we need to be paying the most attention to? Or obviously we should be paying attention to all parts of it, but if we wanted to start somewhere, where would we start?
Don't mutter to each other during an initiation. Be quiet. If you're, don't talk back and forth while somebody's going through an initiation. A candidate, have one prompter. Don't have a bunch of past masters whispering loudly with their hearing aids turned too low. It's that guy's only time to ever go through that degree, and it needs to be made special. So that's something that I want to underscore, period, the end.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen people cutting up during degrees. It's wildly inappropriate.
Yeah.
I want to protect that man's experience because it's the only time he's going to go through that degree. But also, I guess, I tell people I'll show up to Blue Lodge meetings all day long just to sit through that opening and closing. So if you're, philosophically minded and symbolically minded, sitting through just that opening and closing of the lodge is a profoundly beautiful experience. And chapter and council too, man, they're fantastic. If you really consider the symbolism that's being worked through, it's fairly enlightening just going through that.
So that's a way more down-to-earth answer than I expected, and I dig it.
Yeah. Simple,
what were you expecting? A lot more woo?
No, I mean, maybe. Who knows? So is it the first initiation, the initiation as a candidate, that makes the most difference in the majority of people? Is it that the one that makes the most difference, or do you find that it's one of the later stages of initiation that makes more of a difference?
Oh man, I don't know. I mean, I guess it would depend on the individual, and I think it'd probably be different for every person. I mean, I kind of put the focus on that first stage of initiation when they're the candidate, because you got a bunch of guys who maybe go through the process or maybe just get their EA and they never make it through to Master Mason, but at some point in their life that EA is having an effect on them, and it's going to change the way they view the world around them. You also have, like in Scottish Rite, the cap and dash phenomenon. When I get my 32nd degree, get my cap, and I'm out. So doing these degrees to the best possible way you can do them, to the highest level, I think is important. Now, we're all humans, so I mean it's going to happen. But also, if you stick it out and you go through these other 3 initiations, I think there's a maturing of understanding that goes on, especially during the memory work, because if you're memorizing material, it's becoming a part of you. I mean, that you do your own associations with the symbols that you're memorizing. So any of that material, you got to find a way to make it yours. So I think by going through that process, it takes you to a deeper understanding of it and a more personal understanding of the work.
Yes. And I would think too, once you get to those second, third, and fourth level, you've got some redos in there, where if it's your first time, there's no redo there.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, if I've seen a degree, 20 times from the sidelines, and I'm still seeing it from the sidelines, that's perfectly okay. But I think that the focus there is don't take it for granted. Realize it's that guy's first time, and actually try and put yourself in their eyes, or try and see something new in the degree. I mean, every time I see a degree, I feel like I get something new out of it, or maybe just a way a guy said something slightly differently. I'm like, oh, wow, it triggered something. Like I didn't think of it from that perspective.
Yeah.
So there's a lot that you can gain just from doing the same thing that you've done before, just with a different team, different perspective. Maybe you're sitting in a different area in the lodge. Maybe you're doing, junior deacon this time. You used to be doing senior warden or whatever, and it changes it up and gives you a different perspective. So I think it's all valuable.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. It comes to you in phases. That's what Masonry is all about. And layers.
Yeah, and that's one of the great things about Masonry, because, as we get older, we can keep diving into it. And even some of the real meatier material, some of the Wilmshurst or Pike or even Joseph Fort Newton, any of these guys, you can read it at different points of your life and get something totally different out of it, which is what makes some of this material great work.
Yeah. No doubt. So you're a psychologist, right? Am I using the right term?
Yeah, licensed psychologist.
So could you give us the overview of that? And do you feel like it has any correlation to the craft?
Sure. Yeah. So kind of what I do, I have one of the great things about going the doctoral route is I can do pretty much whatever I want as far as the focus of my work. I'm not kind of pigeonholed into one thing. So I do actually a lot of psych assessment. I do a lot of forensic work. So I do different assessments. So for the VA, for example, if somebody wants to start the compensation and pension process for a mental health claim, I'm one of the guys that does the reports for that. I evaluate people and do a lot of work with PTSD. In fact, my dissertation was even about PTSD, and had a lot of friends who went off to war and came back profoundly changed. So I've been working an awful lot with trauma. So I do a lot of those evaluations. As far as the therapy side of things go, I do work with trauma as well. I also do, fairly run-of-the-mill therapy as well. Depression, anxiety; those are kind of the common cults of mental health issues. One of the things I do that's more unusual for psychologists is I do psychedelic integration therapy. So that if somebody goes to one of those non-ordinary states of consciousness and then has problems grounding that out and taking those lessons back and integrating it, sometimes that stuff can be pretty profoundly dysregulating for people. I help them integrate it and make sense of whatever weird they experienced.
Oh, so basically, like somebody goes on a really bad trip, doesn't come back normal, and then you help fix that.
Yeah, or if it doesn't even have to be a really bad trip. It may be something that they've had an experience that they can't quite understand, and it's not that terribly distressing to them. But I help them ground it in reality.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Yeah, but and so on the flip side, some of the assessments I do are also for juvenile probation here in Travis County. So I did my postdoc there, and I work a lot with the courts, and I have pretty wide-ranging interests. I'm actually this weekend. I'm actually first thing in the morning before dawn. I'm getting up and headed to San Antonio for a Texas Psych Association conference for a couple days. Then I'm headed back to Austin for a MAPS conference, and they're an interesting group. It's the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. So all those different, medical marijuana studies, or ketamine for treatment of depression, which seems to be working pretty well for people. All those sort of studies are coming out of it, and one of the MAPS is one of the major funders of a lot of those studies. And so, one of the things I'm really excited about through them, as far as trauma treatment goes, is their MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for trauma, for PTSD. It's in phase 3 trials right now, going through governmental trials. And the FDA, actually, after phase 2, designated it as a breakthrough therapy, which is basically fast tracking it, because with the protocol that they're doing, they've actually been able to achieve functional cures of PTSD in 2 out of every 3 people who went through that at 1 year post test. Now that's life changing.
Yeah.
I speak to a lot of combat vets. And a lot of female vets who experience military sexual trauma, and you get people whose lives have been really profoundly impacted by some of these experiences. If you can run them through, a few months of this protocol and have them functionally cured at a year later, that's profoundly life altering. You've basically given them back their lives, because some of these folks are not functioning well at all. In fact, I wear my Masonic ring whenever I'm doing any of my professional work, and working with vets. I get a lot of brothers who are coming through, and I'm encouraging them to go back to lodge, be around guys, start socializing. I think Masonry could be really helpful. But I guess to kind of link that back around, sort of a long way around, but to link that back around, Gabe, I think you were talking about, what was the question about? How does this sort of integrate with the craft?
Yeah. Do you see correlation between it and the craft?
Okay, yeah. I think that the craft has a focus on causing psychospiritual development. Well, I would say maybe it's an effect of going through these rituals and engaging in the mystic tie with your brethren. You're going to go through some personal development, either psychologically or spiritually or both. I mean, quite often participating in Masonry brings people closer to their faith, right? So you hear that all the time, and it tends to work out that way. So I think that from a developmental model, Masonry is excellent at helping people grow. And ideally, psychology should help people manage any issues that are causing them to be held back or getting stuck. And from there, you should be able to start taking some steps into the positive and starting to move that ball further down the court as far as your personal growth goes. So, yeah, I mean, psychology and masonry are two different ways to go about causing these sort of changes.
So I do have a question now.
Hashtag go ahead, Billy.
Right. So as well as talking about like the spiritual and personal development, I guess do you also see, the value of the accepting social network that Freemasonry offers?
Absolutely. So, this is something that I personally struggled with a little bit. So when I was younger, I felt pretty alienated from the mainstream. If you see me, like I'm usually in a really nice suit, but I've got gauges in my ears, under the suit, I've got a bunch of tattoos. When I was coming up, I was kind of fairly counterculture and didn't feel all that accepted. And so within Masonry, I kind of went through this whole journey of wanting to help people and figure out how to reorient my profession. I was originally in IT, just doing tech work till the tech crash happened, and then decided, well, since there's no jobs, I might as well go back to school and do something else. Mm-hmm. And want to do something where I could help people. Well, same kind of thing with Masonry. And I think that, I think that Masonry can definitely help along those lines. And now that I've gone down that's right. I was losing track of my thought there. So as far as being welcomed into Masonry, having gone from this sort of place where when I was younger, I felt kind of, like, what is this weird world I find myself in? Doesn't make much sense, to then being accepted into Masonry, and being accepted by all these brothers from very different walks of life. I mean, I feel much more pro-social now. I feel much more integrated with the community. I'm doing a fair amount of charitable works now, donating a lot of time. I'm doing a lot of political work now and working within systems where the teenage me and early 20s me would have never thought that I'd be doing any of this stuff. But I think Masonry really kind of moves people in that direction. And if you think about it, out in the country, if you're a guy who's just working in the field, or maybe out in West Texas working in the oil field all day long, and you go to lodge and you start going through line and you start having to stand up and talk in front of people and start to use a modified version of Robert's Rules of Order, and you start learning all these public speaking and administration skills, all of a sudden you've got all these skills. Well, there's no wonder that, much of the mayors and councilmen in these small towns were traditionally Masons, because where are you going to learn that?
Yeah.
Right. I wanted to circle back on something that you said, and this is more for my personal curiosity. It's not anything I had prepared, but you mentioned treatment of depression using ketamine, right? And that's something that I've kind of heard about, but my context for ketamine is, one, as a horse tranquilizer, and then two, as a dissociative recreational drug. How does that work in treating depression? This is just for my edification.
Sure. So I'm not sure what the actual action is for that. You might be better referred to Brother Zach Tedder for details on that, since he works more intimately with people in his job within the overall psych umbrella of dealing with folks with depression with ketamine. I've had a few patients who've been taking those treatments. What I observe is it tends to give them a shift in consciousness, which gives them a shift in perspective. So someone who's depressed, there's a couple different types of depression that we talk about kind of back in psychoanalytic psychology days. There's like the vegetative depression, the kind of like sitting there on the couch, woe is me, I can't get up, can't do anything, But then there's also an agitated depression, where that causes you to get angry. You're irritable, you're grumpy all the time because you're so miserable. You're kind of lashing out at other people and at yourself. So from any of those, you're kind of working with some blinders on, or so I kind of like make a distinction between like the rose-colored glasses where the whole world looks great, and then your poop-covered glasses where everything looks like crap around you, right? That's kind of the lenses that people with depression have on. Well, give them a dissociative where they're taken out of their body and they're given a radically different experience. It tends to cause mood elevation, and it tends to stick around for a while as well. It tends to have pretty good results. I know there's been experiments with psilocybin mushrooms as well. I was at a American Psychological Association conference back in 2007 where some guys from Johns Hopkins University, they actually presented their research on redoing the classical Good Friday experiment, which if you're interested in that, you can always look up Good Friday experiment. It's one of the classic 60s psychedelic experiments. But they said that people at 1 year post-test who had never done anything like that before had rated that as one of the most profound spiritual experiences in their lives. And I think some of that radical shift in perspective allows people it forces people to confront the fact that there's more out there than just what's in front of their face. There's different ways of experiencing the world. In fact, at that APA conference, it was interesting. There was an ex-director of NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, who was there, and he said only reason they stopped that research in the 60s was because the researchers became part of the party. Think about Timothy Leary and his, turn on, tune in, drop out kind of message. You can't have that. You got to have actual science if you're going to be doing something like this, especially as taboo as some of these substances are. So interesting stuff for sure. But to get back to ketamine, they're showing some good responses with treatment-resistant depression. I did have one patient who I had to refer to inpatient because his depression was so extremely severe that even with ketamine treatments, he was receiving some boost in energy, but still wasn't able to get over this threshold to get anything done. His motivation was still tanked and just wasn't going anywhere. But that was one of the most extreme cases I'd seen outside of a state hospital. So I think that for most moderate depression that tends to be a little bit treatment resistant, that could be helpful. But also, for depression, we've got plenty of antidepressants out there that do a great job that can help moderate things. And Gold Star treatment is pairing an antidepressant with talk therapy, because the antidepressant is going to give you enough of a boost to where you can start to get the motivation to actually do something about it, while the talk therapy, you get into really looking at the ways you're thinking about the world that maybe keep you in that low mood. And if you can have somebody who's an expert in human behavior, kind of as a consultant, who will then challenge some of your beliefs that may not be serving you very well, that once were pretty adaptive but have become maladaptive over time, then you can start looking at the world in a little bit different way and kind of fix your own problems. I mean, none of us are beyond fixing our own stuff. Just sometimes it helps to have a trainer to walk you along.
Yeah. It's an interesting way to look at it for sure.
So I want to touch on something that you mentioned, earlier in the episode, Jungian psychology. And I'm very curious about Jungian psychology, and I'm sure some of our listeners are, and about its relation to symbolry, which I don't know if the proper term is symbolry or symbology, but I've heard both used. Can you give us a crash course in Jungian psychology, Jungian symbolism, and how it and then after that, how it relates to the initiatic experience in a Masonic lodge?
Oh, geez,
I know that's a tall order, but let's pretend I don't know anything about Jungian psychology, because I don't, and you have to explain it to me. Okay.
Yeah. I don't know if we have enough time to really go over any depth about
Sure.
Jung.
Oh, just an overview.
Well, he has a quote. Well, actually, I'll let me get into a bit. So there's like archetypes, right? His idea of archetypes are kind of these symbols that transcend. They're integrated in the human experience, but that maybe transcend the individual. So, like a persona, kind of the mask we wear. There's the anima and the animus, the masculine and feminine sides of our psyche. There's the shadow, which is like the shadow. It sounds spooky. I mean, it's October now, so at least while we're recording this, I'll see y'all in Thanksgiving when this comes out, though.
Yeah.
But the shadow is anything that's not in the light of conscious awareness. So that could be good. That could be bad. That could be so it could be something like, I don't want to be seen as a kind of person who, yells at somebody in a grocery store. So if I do that and I behave badly, maybe I stuff that down into my unconscious, and I just don't even think about it anymore because it's too against the way I view myself. Right.
So that would be like part of your shadow archetype.
Right. Or it could be maybe something good, like maybe you have a fear of success that's holding you back and you don't realize it. And that fear of success is lodged in the shadow. Right. So that may be also there. So, but literally it's anything that's not in the light of conscious awareness. So there's a lot of stuff that's in that shadow. It's a big chunk. And then there's also the self. There's a capital S self, which is the entirety of the psyche. So that includes your conscious awareness, your ego self, like Freud had defined the ego as the I. So it's that part of your consciousness that that says, I'm David. Hi, this is my experience. That aspect of your consciousness that we often identify ourselves with, that's just the tip of the iceberg. That's tiny. And in fact, that ego consciousness, that sense of I, that sense of small s self, is actually, it's a very useful filter, but it gets in the way as much as it helps. So that's why within esoteric work, within deep spiritual and mystical work, there's a lot of work in loosening that tight hold on the ego. You want to just hold that very lightly as sort of as the filter that it is. It allows us to interface with other people and beings on this material plane, right? Then you have the unconscious, which is basically the individual unconscious can be defined kind of the same as the shadow, but the way that Jung took it, he was Freud's heir apparent for a long time until he split from Freud's perspective and kind of went his own route. And he developed an idea called the collective unconscious. So there are certain things that are common to the human experience that are shared, like fear of the dark, right? All of that lies within the collective unconscious. And these archetypes lie within the collective unconscious as well, and is expressed through the personal unconscious. So kind of some different ways to think about it. And the self is the capital S self is the integration of all of that into one whole. And that happens through a process that Jung termed as individuation. And individuation is just sort of integrating all of those aspects of your psyche. Like when a boy becomes a man, he should have individuated and become his own being as his own man, and not dependent on anyone else or anyone else's thoughts. That's that sort of very independent, well-integrated person. Someone who's successfully individuated and come to the sense of the capital S self. So, but then to kind of flip it back to Masonry and symbolism, symbology, or whatever. I've heard a bunch of terms too. One of the things that Jung gets really into is alchemy. So he talks about alchemical stages, and within Masonry, we certainly have a lot of covert and overt alchemical symbolism. So the Mark Master degree. Like it talks about that white stone.
Yeah, the white stone.
Yeah, I mean that's alchemical. Oh, get it. That's a philosopher's stone right there. And the Scottish Rite, you got the 3 colors of the caps in the southern jurisdiction. That's alchemical symbolism as well. It's pretty overt. But that white stone is something that's hidden unless you know. Like when I first started memorizing some of that stuff for that Mark Master, and I saw that, I was like, oh my God, that was there the whole time. It's a little mind blowing. But so there's that. Also, I've got a book where that's some transcribed lectures of Jung's, where he was talking about the chakra symbolism and tying in psychological concepts to that. It's some really meaty material. So I mean that ties it into yoga. If you get into some of the quasi-Masonic organizations of the 1800s, like the Golden Dawn, for example, that came out of the Societas Rosicruciana and Anglica. It's sort of the Golden Dawn spun off as a more esoteric, ceremonial magic and deep Kabbalistic study group. And so for a group like that, you're going to find a lot more links into Jung's work, because he starts bringing in a lot of the Eastern mysteries that were in vogue in the 1800s and late 1700s as well within Europe, and started integrating some of that material in a way to where psychological concepts could be spoken about in the same breath as some of these esoteric concepts. So he formed a link between those. So I think that's why he's typically, when psychology comes up, he's a bit of a darling in Masonic and esoteric circles.
Wow. Okay, that was awesome. That and all
you
of that.
For it.
Well, no, and all of it made sense. It was communicated at a level that I understood. Because a lot of times when psychological discussion comes up, I feel totally lost. So, kind of touching on that, a lot of these systems like Golden Dawn, OTO. From what I've seen, OTA a little bit, and all numerous systems deal with this concept of crossing the abyss, right? Mm-hmm. And the reason why I bring them up is because all of these kind of tie into Jungian symbology, or at least express some level of Jungian concepts, and I'm assuming you're familiar with the concept of crossing the abyss.
Oh, sure.
In actual psychological terms, what is crossing the abyss from more of a standard scientific or medical perspective, or I guess psychological perspective?
Sure, I'll see if I can translate that. So the idea of, for those who aren't familiar with the concept, typically within these, like Golden Dawn, for example, or Crowley's Golden Dawn spinoff, the AA, or any of these modern orders that are doing similar work, their grades are based on the Tree of Life, the Kabbalistic Tree of Life, on the different Sephiroth of the Tree of Life, and that they inherited that from SRIA, who inherited that from the German Golden Rosenkreutzer, their Rosicrucian old school group, and but the Golden Dawn really started working people through these grades in a way that's supposedly designed to have some psychospiritual development occur. So there are 2 main crises of the adept of those systems. One is at Tiferet, which is the place of the sun. It's a place of balance on the Tree of Life, right in the center. And that is known as the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel. Kind of a hokey name, but that's what it's been termed. And that's basically based on an old school book translated by MacGregor Mathers called The Book of the Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage. And this was this old Jewish ceremony where it involves a lot of prayer, and basically over the course of either 6, 9, or I think 15 months, depending on which document you look at. It's supposed to get you in touch with your link with the divine. So the idea being that there's a spark of God within each of us that as we're just going about our workaday world, we're mostly ignoring. That may be something that comes up in us when we're doing something we love and are thrilled by. We touch into our sort of our primal, our true self, that the thing that really sparks joy and fulfillment in us. That's a good sign you're headed in the right path. But the idea is that you kindle this into a flame, and Edgar Cayce describes this as Christ consciousness. The Hare Krishnas would call it Krishna consciousness. There's tons of terms for this stuff. But it's basically getting into contact with your divine guide. Mystics have been getting in touch with God in various fashions along these lines for probably all the time. From there, there's a different experience, which above Tiferet, there's only one direct path up to the top of the tree, which is Keter, which is sort of the initial spark of creation, right, within this particular model. And that basically, that's the path of the arrow, and that's through meditation. You can get to the trance of samadhi, which is this whole idea within the yogic literature of unity with all, unity with everything. See, Gabe, you did get me to go pretty deep into the woo. But the abyss lies between Tiferet, that heart center, that solar center, the sun, and the spark of God at the top. There's different spheres between there, but basically the next crisis is it appears there's no direct path up to from a certain point up to the third sphere. And so you have to cast yourself with no path across in sort of a leap of faith. And that leap of faith from a psychological perspective deals a lot with the ego. And like I was talking about before, that sense of I. So the idea is with this abyss experience is that you should be able to divorce yourself from your ego and end up viewing the world from above the ruach, or the sort of the rational mind. So you're viewing it from a larger perspective. Maybe one way to think about this is the concept of the witness or the observer, where if you've ever had an experience where you're kind of seeing yourself from above as you're going through life doing something. And so you sort of have this dual perspective. You're in it, but also you're observing it at the same time. It's sort of a weird bifurcation of consciousness. But I think for the most part, a lot of that is really some work in humility. So a lot of this is divorcing yourself from this idea that you are important. Right? None of us are really important. We're all these weird, like, neurotic monkeys on a tiny speck in one, like, janky corner of the universe. So what makes us special? Well, we sure think we are, and that's our own deficit. And the only reason we think we are is because it gives us an advantage evolutionarily in interacting with other people on our particular tiny speck of dust in the universe. So getting over yourself, I think, is a big part of this abyss process. You're supposed to leave the ego behind and transcend the ego. Well, okay, you can't really do that functionally because you still have to go to work and pay bills and do all this, and you can't just sit in a cave somewhere and meditate until you wither away. So the trick is sort of managing your ego and continually working with it so that when you're speaking from a place of I'm doing this or I'm doing that, you're consciously in a place where that's a bit of a distant connection. That sense of I is. It's kind of on the path towards non-dualistic consciousness, which is a whole Zen concept that one of my teachers in grad school was a heavy practitioner of. And I that's even beyond the abyss concept. I think this or maybe it's wrapped up in it. Actually, it's kind of the idea that we are all one, right? Truly, the universe is all one. The consciousness of the universe is all one. We're all individual sparks of that consciousness. We're all the universe experiencing itself. And so from that perspective, like, we're just a node of consciousness in this greater experience of the universe experiencing itself. So I think that's a part of it as well. Yeah, I think that's maybe a deep dive into woo for you guys.
Oh no, I'm in love with it. That's awesome.
That's good stuff. Well, I've got one last question for you before we wrap this up. So as far as your aspirations and future in Masonry, what role do you see yourself playing?
Well, I guess right now, I tend to be fairly deeply into the philosophy and the esoterics and the woo, but I tend to be very grounded in practicality with the way I try to always bring that heady stuff down to very practical action. So first thing I want to do is get through my year in the East in my Blue Lodge. And then I'm going to be in the Easton Council and the Easton Chapter. So I've got a fair amount of administrative work ahead of me, which I'm happy to do, and it's been a fantastic growth experience. But I'm actually really looking forward to being a past master. And so one of the things I'm learning my year in the East is that you can be really busy with administration. Unfortunately, in my lodge, my secretary had a heart attack after our first meeting and has not been present much this year because of his health concerns. And then just recently his father died. So my prayers go out to you, Terry. If you ever listen to this, you're definitely in my heart. So it's been tough on him, tough on the lodge. And so there's a lot of administrivia that has to go on. So what I'm noticing is that there's a lot of goals that I had. You always hear about past masters saying, just pick one thing, just get one thing done. Joe Shriver is saying, just do one thing in your year as his year of most excellent Grand High Priest, right? This idea of doing one thing, that makes a lot of sense. It makes more sense to me now because as a new master, we all come in very ambitious. We're going to change the world, right? But then there's all this administrative stuff. Man, I got to run a meeting. I got to flip between ritual mode and meeting running mode, then back to ritual mode. And how do I do this? And there's a lot of overhead there. Being a past master, I'll be able to focus on just specific projects for the lodge, specific projects for other bodies. So other people can handle all that administrative stuff once I'm through there. And then I can focus on something specific. Like if I want to run a festive board, I can get a great speaker and run a festive board. If I want to look at scanning in all the old minutes and doing a history of the lodge, by God, I can do that. I'll have the time to do a deep dive into it. If I want to be a glutton for punishment like Rhit and run for secretary for a while, I could do that and focus on administrivia. But that would free me up to do a little bit deeper work for the lodge and the other bodies. And I'm also really interested in Masonic education and esoterics. I mean, obviously, from the conversation. So, I'm always kind of deepening my studies there. I'd really like to submit a paper to the Lodge of Research at some point. I really, doing psych evals for probably 2/3 of my practice, I'm writing a ton. So I write hundreds and hundreds of pages every week. So by the time I get home, the last thing I want to do is more typing. So that's why I do, I'm happy to do talks because it's engaging. I get to express some of the cool stuff I'm reading about and sort of integrating and thinking about and get feedback from brethren on it. It's a lot of fun. But at some point I want to sit down and actually write one of those papers. I'm really happy to be a member of the Lodge of Research, just an average member. I haven't submitted a paper yet, but it's something I definitely aspire to do.
Yeah, interesting. Good stuff. One step at a time, man.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying the Masonic experience, and each thing I do, like, there's always another step. I mean, there's always something new to explore and help unfold. In Austin, we were talking about trying to get an Academy of Reflection started with Austin Scottish Rite. So,
Rhit, we're going to have to race them there.
I know it. The race is on.
Yeah, well, we'll see. It will happen in Austin when it happens. We got a bunch of guys who are interested. Some of the guys from Lodge 12 are doing a regular meditation group. That's a way to actually practice some of the things that we inculcate. And I think that would be a good thing to do as well.
Good stuff. Well, you guys got any last questions before I give us the quote of the week? I'll take that as a no.
Yeah, my cup runneth over.
Yeah, it sounds good.
I had a question, but I literally forgot it from getting wrapped up in the Jungian one.
Well, that's a good segue because I picked Carl Jung as our quote of the week. I thought it was very fitting. His quote is, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes."
Ooh.
I thought that was very Freemasonic-y.
Absolutely.
I like that.
True.
He's a guy I want to learn more about for sure. Gabe, you want to throw some contact info and we'll wrap this bad boy up?
Sure. Folks, if you want to learn more about us, our lodge's website is www.fortworth148.org. Our Facebook handle is at Fort Worth Lodge 148, and it's the same for our Twitter and our Instagram page. Our email is fortworth148@gmail.com. And we run an annual Masonic education conference called Texas Masonicon, and the next one is in July of 2020. You can learn more about that at texasmasonicon.com, texasmasonicon.com. Please remember, if you feel like it, to leave a review of the show and to rate us, as that helps us get noticed and bring the show to more listeners. And we'd like to wish you a very sincere Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and Happy Holidays in general, and a Happy New Year from the Fort Worth 148 Masonic podcast team.
For sure, man. And David, if anybody wanted to get a hold of you to do a presentation, what's the best way? Hunt you down on Facebook or what?
Well, probably just send me an email would be better. Facebook messages tend to get lost. I just have a Gmail address I can use, david.r.hill@gmail.com.
There you go, folks. All right, gentlemen. Until next season. And I'll see y'all at Grand Lodge. This is Rhit Moore signing off.
This is Billy Hamilton signing off.
This is Gabe Jagush signing off.
And this is David Hill signing off.